A Paris street so packed with speculators it sometimes crushed people against the walls. By the time it was over, the French language had a brand new word for the fortunes made and lost there in a single season: millionaire. Buried Ledger. Episode 3, The Millionaire's Street. In the autumn of 1719, a narrow street in Paris called the Rue Quincampoix was so packed with people trying to buy and sell shares in one company that the crowd sometimes crushed people against the walls. Fortunes were made between breakfast and dinner. It was on that street, that season, that the French language got a new word for the kind of person suddenly being created there by the hundreds: millionaire. This is the story of John Law and the Mississippi Company, the French twin of the South Sea Bubble, unfolding almost the exact same months, in almost the exact same way, except that in France, the man running the scheme wasn't a company director working the edges of government. He was, for a while, the government. It's also, oddly, a story about a real idea and not just a con. The economist Joseph Schumpeter, writing 2 centuries later, ranked Law among the very best monetary theorists in history, and modern historians of central banking credit him with grasping, earlier than almost anyone, that a nation's money supply didn't have to be fixed to the amount of gold sitting in its vaults. He simply proved it by breaking France. John Law was born in Edinburgh in 1671, the son of a goldsmith and banker, and grew into a gambler with a genuine, self-taught gift for mathematics and monetary theory, a rare combination that would define the rest of his life. In April of 1694, at 23, he fought a duel in Bloomsbury Square in London against a man named Edward Beau Wilson, over the affections of a woman named Elizabeth Villiers, and killed him with a single pass of his sword. Law was arrested, tried at the Old Bailey before a judge with a reputation for severity, convicted of murder, and sentenced to death. The sentence was reduced to a fine on the grounds that the killing amounted to manslaughter rather than murder, but Wilson's brother appealed the leniency and had Law thrown back in prison to await execution after all. Law escaped to the continent before it could be carried out, and spent the better part of 2 decades as a wandering gambler and financial theorist across Europe, honing, at gaming tables from Amsterdam to Venice, both a talent for calculating odds and a growing conviction that the entire monetary system Europe ran on was needlessly primitive. Along the way he formed a lasting common-law union with Lady Catherine Knowles, whose own husband was still alive at the time. Since English law of the period offered her no real path to a formal divorce, the couple had 2 children together and stayed together for the rest of Law's life, one of the more stable relationships in a career defined by almost nothing else being stable. To hold high French office at all, Law also had to convert from Protestantism to Catholicism in 1719. French law barred Protestants from senior government posts, a step his own brother William, who stayed Protestant and stayed in a lesser role at the company, never took. Eventually he landed in Paris, where he pitched an idea to Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, who was ruling France as regent for the 7-year-old King Louis XV. France was buried in debt from decades of war under Louis XIV, war debts so large that the crown had, more than once, simply defaulted on portions of it by royal decree. Law's pitch was that paper money, backed by a national bank rather than scarce gold and silver, could unlock the economy, freeing merchants from the constant physical shortage of coin and letting credit expand to match the actual size of French commerce. In 1716 he was allowed to open a private bank, the Banque Générale, to prove it. It worked well enough that the French crown nationalized it in January of 1719, renaming it the Banque Royale, with the government now guaranteeing its paper notes. Meanwhile, Law had also been building a trading company, the Mississippi Company, granted a monopoly on French trade with Louisiana in August of 1717. Over the following months he folded in the French East India Company, the tobacco monopoly, and, this was the part that really mattered, the right to collect French taxes, until one man controlled the nation's central bank and its dominant business monopoly at the same time, meaning he could print the money and issue the stock people used it to buy, in a closed loop with no outside check on either side. The regent, heedless of the danger, kept pushing Law to expand faster than Law himself had proposed, ordering 300,000 new shares issued against an original plan for 50,000, and authorizing the printing of 1 billion livres in new banknotes in a single year, far beyond anything the underlying economy could actually absorb. The Louisiana trade underneath all of this was, like the South Sea Company's slave trade concession across the Channel, far thinner than the stock price implied. The colony itself was barely populated when Law's monopoly began. French Louisiana in 1717 held only a few hundred European settlers, nowhere near enough labor to make the tobacco, fur, and mineral riches the company advertised to Paris actually materialize. So the Mississippi Company and the French crown manufactured a population by force. An ordinance issued in Paris in November of 1718 authorized local authorities to round up anyone classified as a vagabond, a beggar, or a petty criminal and ship them to Louisiana against their will. The first such forced convoy landed on the Gulf Coast in September of 1719, the same autumn the company's stock was tripling on the Rue Quincampoix. Contemporary colonial intake records describe the new, unwilling citizens of the settlement founded that same year at New Orleans, named for the regent himself, in terms like, a mad vagabond night prowler, and, a libertine who had threatened to kill his mother. Before the Crown finally outlawed the practice in 1722, the company had forcibly transported well over 1,000 people, many of them teenagers, across the Atlantic to populate a colony that existed, at that point, mostly as a rumor propping up a stock price 4,000 miles away. The mechanical trick underneath all of it, stripped down, was almost identical to what South Sea was doing in London that same year: convert government debt, in France's case, bonds called billets d'état, issued against a crown that had already partially defaulted on them once, into company shares that looked, and briefly traded, like a far better bet than the debt they replaced. Law's version added one extra, uniquely dangerous ingredient the British never had: he also owned the printing press. When the government needed more buyers for more shares, Law's bank simply issued more paper livres to lend them, so the money chasing the stock and the stock itself were, increasingly, made of the same manufactured air. By January of 1720, with note issuance running far ahead of anything the French economy could actually use, monthly inflation in Paris is estimated to have reached as high as 23%, prices for ordinary goods climbing so fast that the connection between a livre note and anything it could reliably buy was dissolving in real time, months before the share price itself even began to crack. Share prices went from around 500 livres in January of 1719 to roughly 10,000 livres by December, an increase of nearly 1,900% in under a year, with some accounts of the peak in early 1720 running even higher, past 12,000 livres a share. Law personally became one of the richest men in Europe, eventually owning a third of the Place Vendôme. The regent made him Controller General of Finances, an immigrant, a Protestant convert, a convicted killer under an old death sentence back in Britain, now running the entire fiscal apparatus of the French state, while a mob of speculators fought for elbow room on his street to buy paper promising a share of it. Picture that street directly, because the scene itself became as famous as the scheme. The Rue Quincampoix was a narrow, unremarkable lane before 1719, within months it became so densely packed with buyers and sellers that the city posted guards at either end and closed it to carriage traffic just to keep people from being trampled. Rents on rooms overlooking the street reportedly rose by a factor of 10 or more, since a window above the crowd let a landlord watch, and sometimes broker, deals from a height. A hunchback man is said to have rented out the use of his own back as a makeshift writing desk to traders who needed a flat surface to sign a contract on the spot, reportedly making a small fortune of his own simply by being conveniently shaped and standing in the right place at the right time. It was out of scenes exactly like that one that the French coined the word millionaire, for men worth 1 million livres who, months earlier, had been worth nothing close to it. The frenzy pulled in the most powerful families in France, not just ordinary speculators, and their appetite occasionally collided head-on with Law's own. The Prince de Conti, a senior nobleman and early supporter of the scheme, grew furious when he felt he'd been shorted on an allocation of new shares he believed he was owed. In retaliation, he gathered his notes and demanded Law's bank redeem them for hard coin on the spot, a sum so large that carrying it away required 3 separate wagons. Law had no legal choice but to comply, even as he understood, better than almost anyone else in France, exactly what it meant if enough people with that kind of leverage decided to do the same thing at once. The unraveling started in earnest in early 1720, when well-placed insiders, reportedly including members of the French nobility close to the regent, some of the very people who'd profited earliest and most, began quietly converting their shares and notes into gold and moving it out of the country ahead of everyone else. To stop the drain, Law's government restricted how much gold and silver private citizens could hold or carry, at one point banning the possession of more than a small amount of coin altogether, which only confirmed to the public that something was badly wrong and accelerated the very panic the restriction was meant to prevent. On the 1st of May, 1720, the government itself cut the official share price nearly in half, from 9,000 to 5,000 livres, trying to manage the collapse in an orderly way and instead detonating it immediately. The announcement alone erased years of paper wealth in an afternoon. What followed at the bank itself turned genuinely deadly. Crowds mobbed the Banque Royale for weeks trying to redeem paper notes for real coin before the notes became worthless entirely. On the 17th of July, 1720, the crush outside the bank's doors grew so severe that 15 people were reportedly crushed to death in the crowd, trampled by a mob desperate to reach a teller's window before the money ran out. By the time the dust settled and the full collapse played out through the rest of the year, South Sea style, shares that had traded near 12,500 livres at the peak had fallen to around 200 livres by December, a decline of roughly 98%, a number that, put plainly, meant nearly the entire fortune of nearly everyone who had held on was simply gone. Economic historians estimate that, across pensions, banknotes, and bank deposits combined, something on the order of 80% of the paper wealth France had accumulated over the preceding 3 years was wiped out in the space of months, not a metaphor about lost fortunes, but close to the literal share of the country's newly created money that simply ceased to represent anything at all. Not everyone lost. An Irish-French financier and economic theorist named Richard Cantillon, who had watched Law's scheme from close range and correctly judged early on that the mathematics behind it couldn't hold, bought in when shares were still cheap, sold well before the top, and converted his profits into gold rather than staying in French paper or reinvesting in the next round of shares. He kept nearly all of it. Cantillon became, by some estimates, one of the very few people to walk away from the entire episode meaningfully richer than he'd started, precisely because he treated Law's own paper money the way Law least wanted anyone to treat it, as something to be converted into something real at the first opportunity, rather than trusted. His own ending, years later, carried its own dark irony for a man who'd made a fortune reading a financial scheme correctly. In May of 1734, living in London, Cantillon was found dead in his bed with his house burning down around him, his head badly burned, in what a post-mortem examination concluded was murder staged to look like a fire. 3 of his household servants were tried and acquitted. A French cook he dismissed weeks earlier fled the country with a quantity of his valuables and was never found. The case was never solved. Here's the buried part, and it's a harder one than the South Sea bubbles, because in France it wasn't really buried, it was simply left where it fell, on the people who couldn't get out in time. The insiders who cashed out early kept their gold. The regent who had backed Law faced no formal reckoning of any kind. Law himself fled France in disguise on the 28th of December, 1720, his properties seized, and spent his remaining 9 years wandering Europe, Brussels, Rome, Copenhagen, Venice, trying and failing to gamble his way back to solvency, before dying poor in Venice in 1729, still insisting his underlying theory about paper money and credit had been fundamentally sound, undone only by the greed of the men who'd forced him to expand it faster than he'd ever intended. The Mississippi Company itself did not simply vanish along with Law. Stripped of its banking and tax-collecting powers, it was placed under direct government receivership in April of 1721, its debts and remaining colonial assets slowly wound down and absorbed by the crown over the following years, a quieter, more bureaucratic death than the collapse that preceded it, unfolding almost entirely out of public view while Law himself was already gone from the country. It was ordinary noteholders, the people who had crowded the Rue Quincampoix hoping to become the next millionaire, who were left holding a currency the state itself had just admitted was worth less than they'd paid for it. There was no parliamentary committee in France the way there was in London, no formal accounting of who had known what and when. France's appetite for paper money and central banking was so badly scarred by the experience that the country avoided both for the better part of a century, a caution that some historians argue left the French crown with fewer financial tools than its rivals right up through the fiscal crises that helped trigger the revolution decades later, when a very different Parisian crowd would again gather in the streets over a government's inability to pay what it owed. Amsterdam printers, watching all three markets, Dutch, French, and British, convulse within months of each other, rushed out a massive illustrated compendium before the end of 1720 called Het Groot Tafereel der Dwaasheid, the Great Mirror of Folly, more than 70 satirical prints, pamphlets, mock playing cards, and poems bound into one enormous volume, mocking speculators in all three countries as gamblers, fools, and men possessed by literal demons. It sold widely enough across Europe that later printing swapped in English captions for English readers. Most surviving copies today aren't even complete books anymore. Collectors broke them apart decades later to sell the engravings individually, which means the clearest surviving record of how ordinary Europeans processed watching three currencies and three stock markets crash in the same 12 months now exists mostly in fragments, scattered across museum print rooms, in roughly the same condition as the ledgers underneath it. Two bubbles, London and Paris, the same debt for stock trick, inflating and collapsing within months of each other in 1720, not entirely a coincidence, since both countries were drowning in war debt from the same decades of European conflict and reaching for the same experimental fix. Britain's version ran through a private company operating in the shadow of Parliament. France's version ran through one man who briefly became the state's own printing press and its own stock exchange at once, with no separation left between the two to catch the failure of either. One country buried its scandal in quiet cover-up. The other buried its ruined creditors in silence and moved on to the next regime. And the deportees who never asked to build a colony, the noteholders on the Rue Quincampoix, the servants tried and acquitted for a murder that was never solved, none of them appear anywhere near the front of the story historians usually tell about the brilliant Scottish theorist who briefly ran France. Either way, the ledger doesn't balance itself, and someone always ends up holding the difference. That's the story for this week. I'm back with the next one soon. This has been Buried Ledger.